Faze Clan and Gen.G have been the two best teams in North America by a wide margin this season. And if you want proof of that, all you need to do is look at the current North American standings, because we have Gen.G in first, Faze Clan right behind them in second, and then a huge gap all the way down to G2 in third place. And both of these teams have had their part of the season where they look like the best team in North America. In fall, that team was Gen.G, because they went to the grand finals in all three regionals, including winning the last one, and then they won the fall split major. But in the winter split, we saw Faze Clan rise up to the #1 spot, because they won 2 regionals, and they went all the way to the grand finals of that major, before losing to the French Monstars, otherwise known as K-Corp. So looking at these two teams individually, it's already interesting to see how well they've played. But it gets even more interesting when you look at how these two teams matched up against each other so far this season. In RLCS competition, these two teams have played 10 times, with Faze winning 6 series and Gen.G winning 4. And when you have two top teams battling against each other so tightly, then you would expect each team to be trading wins off of each other. But that's not really how it's gone for these teams. Because instead of trading wins with each other, they've each gone on huge winning streaks. And that started in the first event of the season, the Fall Open. Because if you include the top 16 qualifier, Faze Clan and Gen.G played each other 3 times in that event, and Faze Clan won all 3 times. And none of those series were all that close either, because Gen.G only got 2 game wins in those 3 series combined. But then for the rest of the fall split, Gen.G took control of the matchup and they won 4 straight series against Faze, with most of those series again being very one-sided. And then finally in the winter split, they played against each other 3 times, and then Faze again won all 3. These matches have been really important for both teams, because they both serve as a stepping stone and an obstacle on each other's path to greatness. These teams have faced off in 7 different events, and every single time, the winner of this matchup has made it to the grand finals. And in 5 out of 7 of those events, they won the entire thing. So I think it's pretty fair to say that this matchup has been the most important in North America this season. And instead of going back and forth trading wins, whenever somebody has the advantage in this matchup, they usually hold on to it for a while. So I'm going to take a look at exactly what's going on between these two teams, and I'm going to talk about this matchup moving forward. Because with teams like version 1 and Complexity breathing down these two teams' necks for the right to be called the best in North America, the implications of this matchup might look very different going forward. So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. In order to get a full understanding on this matchup, we first need to get an understanding on these individual teams. So let's start by taking a look at Faze Clan, and more specifically, Miss. He's a pretty fun case because it's been a long time since the go-to strategy in Rocket League was to have a dedicated third man. We do still see it from time to time in players like Chronic for Team Liquid and Torment/Daniel for version 1, since Daniel's gonna presumably fit right into that role. But all in all, it's a lot less common. But we have Miss being a perfect example to show that if the defender's good enough, then that strategy can still work. And he's without a doubt a bona fide third man, because he has the second most time in the region as farthest back, behind only Daniel, and he's first in overall time spent in the defensive third. And as the cherry on top, he's also 10th in saves per game in the region. So he plays a lot of defense for this team, but he's really good at it too, proven in part by the fact that he won defensive MVP at the Winter Major. But even though he's their go-to defender, he still has that great shooting ability that he showed earlier in his career, especially when he was on Team Envy. His shooting volume might be down from where it was back then, because he has the 12th fewest shots per game in the region, but he makes up for it by taking advantage of all of his opportunities, because he also has the best shooting percentage in North America. So to summarize, he's the go-to defender with a scoring touch of his own, which is a perfect segue into Cypical, because that's exactly what he used to do for his former team Space Station. He'd be the primary defender for that team, but then if he got the ball on offense, he'd be very efficient with his chances. But when he came to Faze Clan, he stopped playing that role, and instead spent a lot more time further up the field. And this was kind of an iffy choice back when they had AJ still, but now that they have Miss as that backline defender, this works out a lot better. And speaking of spending more time further upfield, Cypical and First Killer are both in the top 10 for time spent as farthest forward on the field. But the interesting part about it is that even though they're really close in that stat, First Killer still has a lot more time in the offensive third than Cypical. Which means that when First Killer's farthest up the field, it's usually when he and the team are both up on offense. But when Cypical's the farthest man forward, it's usually when the team's in a more defensive position as a whole, with all 3 players being slightly farther back on the field. And to me, this screams second man. He's not all the way back as often as Mist, but he's not all the way forward as often as First Killer. But instead he's between these two extremes, tying everything together. And this is a good fit for him because he's still really good at defense, just like he was on Space Station. The only difference is that he's playing that defense farther up the field. And just like Miss, even though he doesn't have many shooting opportunities, he's still very efficient with the ones that he gets. He's in the bottom 20 of the region in shots per game, but he has the 4th highest shooting percentage. That shows that both he and Mist are really good at waiting for the right opportunity to shoot, and then taking advantage of it when that opportunity comes. But now, it's time to talk about the star of this team, and frankly the star of North America in First Killer. I talked about how Mist is the third man and Sipical's the second man, so naturally it's only fair to assume that First Killer plays that first man role. And he definitely does, but he also kinda doesn't sometimes. He fits into that first man role by spending the most time on the team in the offensive third, and he also leads the team in boost steals and shots. And while I'm on the subject of his shooting, I just talked about how efficient Sipical and Mist are on few opportunities, and typically when you get a higher volume of shots, that comes along with a lower efficiency. So since First Killer is 5th in the region in shots per game, you would probably expect his efficiency to be lower. But First Killer is an exception to this rule because he still has the 3rd highest shooting percentage in the region, being even higher than Sipical. So he shoots a lot, but compared to everybody else in the region, he makes it a lot too, which is honestly pretty scary. But he also doesn't fit into that typical first man role because of the impact that he makes all over the field. Typically when you see a player playing offense so much, they offset that by not playing a lot of defense, especially when they have teammates who are really good defenders and can back them up. That's been the case for a lot of players, like Rise when he was on Moist, both Atto and Oski for Team Liquid, and a certain striker that we'll talk about later in this video. But First Killer isn't like the rest of them, because while he plays a lot of offense, he plays a lot of defense too. He's 5th in the region in saves per game, having even more than Mist, but he's also 2nd in the region in goals, and 1st in the region in assists. So while First Killer does play the first man role more than either of his teammates, he's not just the first man, because he's everywhere, doing everything, all the time. I'm honestly tempted to switch up this whole video and only talk about First Killer, because he's really clearing the competition in North America right now. Especially when you look at the Octane rating, because he's first in that stat by a wide margin. And honestly, it seems like this guy can do no wrong, as long as you're not in the last 10 seconds of the deciding game of a major final. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. But if we're going to look at how all of this ties together on the field for Faze, let's take a look at their series against Complexity in the Winter Major. The play starts with First Killer on the ball, naturally, and after a 50 with AJG, he rotates out of the play to refill his boost tank. Then it's Sipical's turn to challenge, but instead of going for it immediately, first he steals the boost, then turns away from the ball to see what kind of hit Razebull's gonna get. And once he sees Razebull's hesitation, then he knows he's clear to turn back into the play and dive for a real challenge. But to Razebull's credit, he does a really good job of keeping the ball under control when he takes this 50. So now CRR is able to come in and take the ball, while Mist is next up in rotation for Faze. And he has First Killer in support behind him too, so he could dive in for his own challenge if he wanted to. But instead, he concedes a little bit of space to CRR and turns away from the ball to get in a much more conservative shadow position. And when CRR's touch is a little bit too heavy for him to control, First Killer is the one who comes in from the other side of the field to take the challenge so that Mist can stay as the farthest one back. Then as the ball goes to the other side of the offensive half, we see First Killer stay aggressive for a little bit longer to get a demo on AJG, and we see Sipical fake another challenge on Razebull, all while Mist is in his comfortable spot as the last man on the field. Then to finish this play out, Sipical pops the ball high to get the ball over CRR, and put it in the spot where Razebull can't get the awkward touch on it because he's really low on boost. And Mist approaches the play just in case he needs to be the one to take the shot, which he's able to do now since First Killer rotated behind him, but when he sees that Sipical has the touch all to himself, he backs off and lets Sipical be the one to score the goal for the Game 7 dagger. So that's kind of a brief rundown of how Faze Clan likes to operate. But now, as we move into looking at Gen.G, we'll immediately start to see the differences between these two teams. Because while Faze Clan have their dedicated third man in Mist, Gen.G have their dedicated first man, and that player is apparently Jack. He likes to be positioned farther down the field, because he has the 4th most time in the region as farthest forward on the field, and he's 6th in most time spent in the offensive third, while neither of his teammates are even in the top half of the region in time spent in the offensive third. But unlike First Killer, who plays first man a lot while also making a huge impact all over the field, Jack doesn't make nearly as much of an impact on defense, in true first man fashion. He has the 6th least time spent in the defensive third, and he also has the 6th fewest saves in the region, so he's one of the most offensive focused players that we have in Rocket League, but he pays that off by also being the most prolific scorer that we have in North America. He's first in the region in goals per game, and he's gotten there by having a combination of shooting volume and shooting efficiency that's only rivaled by First Killer. So he's essentially this team's striker and their main goal scoring threat. But the craziest part about it is that he still probably isn't their most fun player to watch, because that honor has to go to Chronic. He for sure has the best mechanics on the team, and he uses them all over the field, essentially serving as a jack of all trades for this team. He's second on the team in goals behind Jack, and he's second on the team in assists behind Nolly. But he also leads the team in saves per game, because when the team goes on defense, Chronic takes the job of going back to net and making saves, which is the straightforward role on defense, while Jack and Nolly will more often play their defense farther up the field, which requires a lot more nuance in your decision making and is frankly harder to do. So it makes sense that the veterans take that role for themselves. But the biggest way that Chronic makes his impact felt is by being the most ball dominant player on the team, by having a slight lead over Jack for closest average distance to the ball, while also being 5th in the region as a whole for that stat. Also, Octane doesn't track the number of ball touches for whatever reason, but if they did, then I'd be willing to bet that Chronic would lead them in that stat too. But the important thing to note about Jack and Chronic is that they're both offensively focused players, to varying degrees at least, and they both like to spend a lot of time around the ball. So when you have two players like that, the other person on the team has to be really careful, because going in at the wrong time with these two teammates can easily lead to an overcommit. But luckily for them, Nolly is the perfect player to round out this roster, because while Jack and Chronic spend a lot of time really close to the ball, Nolly sits back far away from the play to give them space to work, and this is something that he's done for a long time, going all the way back to when he was with Guild, and again last season on K-Corp when he was alongside Itachi and Astral. He sets up far away from the ball, giving his teammates plenty of room to work, and that's shown by the fact that he has the farthest average distance from the ball out of any player in North America, which is a stat that he's always near or at the top of. This spacing helps out his teammates by giving them more room on the ball, but also helps out his offensive ability by giving himself great vision over the entire play, so he can have a really good idea of how everything's going to develop. So when he has the play downloaded and it's finally his turn to come in for the ball, he knows exactly where all the best passing opportunities are going to be, and he takes advantage of his offensively positioned teammates, especially Jack, to feed them perfect passes for them to score goals. And this ability has helped him to become one of the best passers in the region, being 2nd in assists per game, behind only First Killer, of course. We can see Gen.G's playstyle at work in their championship winning goal from the Fall Major. This play starts with Astral in the corner on the ball, with Chronic closest to him and Jack behind him, and then Nolly stealing boost all the way on the other side of the field, nowhere near the play. Instead of taking the challenge himself, Chronic turns away from the ball to let Jack go for it first. And after Jack's pressure forces the ball off of Astral, Chronic goes in reverse and puts it back on their side of the field. Then Jack tries to get a touch on the ball from upfield, but he gets beat by Joyo, who tries to get his own clear, but he's also blocked by Chronic. Now Rise tries to go for the clear, but he gets a pretty poor touch on it, which means that Chronic can turn around once again and get his 3rd straight touch on the ball. And now, since Jack's the farthest one up the field, and no Moist players are close enough to contest his hit, he's able to hit the ball off the corner and send it infield, into a spot where Nolly can now make his presence felt by going for the ball. And since he has a free touch in front of Moist net, this is a clear chance to take a shot. But both Joyo and Astral are prepared for that. So instead of taking the shot, he spins his car to get his wheels on it to softly drop it down for a pass instead. Because since Joyo's on the back wall and Astral's in the goal, there's a little bit of room in front of the goal for the ball to go into. Then Abjack jumps down from the opponent's back wall to meet the ball and receive that pass, and he knocks in the game-winning goal that gave Gen.G the Fall Major Championship. Alright, so we've looked at each team on their own, so now it's time to look at how the matchup played out on the field, and find out what exactly happened to cause each of these teams to go on the winning streaks that they did when they played each other. So for Faze's first 3 wins in the Fall Open against Gen.G, we saw one of Gen.G's few flaws compared to Faze come back to bite them. In Faze's case, even though Mist is the best defender, all 3 of their players are still really good at defense. But for Gen.G, I don't think that any of their individual defensive abilities can match up to any of the players on Faze. Or in other words, Gen.G's best defender, whoever you think that is, isn't as good at defense as Faze's worst defender, whoever you think that is. Now that's not to say that their defense is bad or anything, because it's still more than good enough to get the job done. But if there is a spot where you're going to take advantage of them, it's going to be here. And we saw that play out twice in the final game of the Fall Open Grand Finals. In this play, we see Chronic on the back wall and Nolly in the goal while Sypical lines up a shot. And while this may not be the most comfortable position, it's still very defendable. And it becomes even more defendable when Sypical's shot isn't that good. Now granted, it's possible that he played the ball like this on purpose just to make it more awkward for Gen.G. But I don't think that was the case. I honestly think he just got a mistouch. I don't know, maybe I'll ask him one day. But regardless, this touch meant that Gen.G was able to be next to the ball, and they had one chance to get a solid clear to try to kill Faze's offensive push. But with that touch, Chronic gets a pretty weak hit that lightly sends the ball out into the middle of the field, while also being 50% of a double commit since Nolly also flipped into the ball trying to get the touch. So because of that, Mist is able to come in from the side and get a pretty easy shot to tie up the game. Then, just over a minute after that, we see Mist come up from his 3rd man spot to get a free touch on the ball. But his touch goes right into the ground and comes off really weak, so it's slowly floating towards Gen.G's goal. And Jack's in position to do whatever he wants with it, but the touch that he gets is not great. The ball stays in the middle of the field and goes right to Sypical, who's able to take a direct shot and get the ball past Jack and Chronic to get the go-ahead goal. On his touch, Jack saw how much room he had around him, So I'm pretty sure his plan was to possess the ball with his first touch and get it under control so he could make another play on it to get the ball out of defense. But since he hit the ball with the front of his car instead of his wheels, the touch ended up being way too heavy, and it turned into another defensive miscue that gave Faze another easy goal. So if you're looking for one common theme in the first 3 matches that these teams played, it would be these defensive missteps from Gen.G and Faze taking advantage of them. So for Gen.G to turn this matchup around and get the winning streak that they did, a couple things had to happen. 1, they couldn't afford to make this many defensive mistakes, not against a team as good as Faze. And during Gen.G's 4-game win streak against Faze, we saw them do that. And overall their defense was a lot more solid, and they weren't making as many really bad mistakes. But for them to really turn things around, that wasn't going to be enough, because there was still one more big issue that they had to overcome. And that issue was the fact that Faze's defense was really, really good, and Gen.G had a lot of trouble breaking through it. In the first 3 series that these teams played against each other, they played a total of 12 games, and in those 12 games, Gen.G only scored 13 goals, giving them 1.08 goals per game against Faze, which is a full goal below their regular average of 2.11 for the season. So if Gen.G was going to turn things around against Faze, they would need to figure out their defense and figure out a way to score some goals. And over the next 4 series that these teams would play in the rest of the fall split, that's exactly what Gen.G did. In the next 4 series when these teams faced off, they played a total of 19 games. And in those games, Gen.G scored 48 goals, giving them a goals per game average of 2.53 against Faze. And the main way that they were able to turn their offense around was by taking advantage of the spaces that Faze gave them. Faze has a really good defense, maybe even the best defense in the world. But even when you have a defense that good, you can't cover everything. And during their winning streak, Gen.G found really creative ways to take advantage of the spaces that Faze left open, doing so in a way that not many other teams can. One way they did that was with their passing, as we saw in their matchup in the Fall Major. After Abjack sends the ball up, Mist controls it on Faze's back wall and brings it all the way down to the ground. And when he does that, Jack turns around to drive in for a challenge. And he doesn't even actually take the challenge, because when he gets to the ball, he turns in field and looks for a bump on Sypical. But the fake challenge forced Mist off of the ball and gives Chronic one free touch with not much time to take it. But with that touch, he side flips into the ball to send it infield to Nolly, and he doesn't have any Faze defenders near him. But when he receives the pass, Sypical dives out at him, so he doesn't have much time to make his touch. But since Mist went super aggressive in trying to block Chronic's hit, and he didn't get it, that took him out of the play. And then First Killer's back defending the goal, which means that right after making his pass, Chronic is now wide open. And of course Nolly sees that and gives the ball right back to him. And from there, Chronic takes the shot, and he cuts off First Killer's angle at the clear, letting him dunk the ball straight into Faze's net. But while they were able to make plays on Faze's defense with their passing, there were other times when they could just beat him with straight up speed and mechanics, like we saw later in that exact same game. Mist is once again the farthest back in rotation, and when he clears the ball, he tries to stay close to it to get a 50 on Jack. But Jack's able to hit it off to the side and keep it out of Mist's reach. Then after neither First Killer nor Nolly get a solid touch on the ball, we see Chronic take possession with all 3 Faze players around him. But since all of Faze's players are right there, that means that the front of the goal is wide open, and Jack is sitting there waiting to take advantage of it. So the only question is, how can Chronic get the ball from here to there as quickly as possible before Faze can recover? He doesn't have a good position for an infield pass, so his best choice is to take it around the corner as quickly as possible. He hits the ball and flips into the corner, and he's able to manipulate his car to land perfectly on the corner so that he's immediately ready for the next hit. And he takes that next hit as quickly as possible to ensure that Sypical can't challenge in time and that Mist can't get back to goal in time to stop the shot. So thanks to Chronic using his great speed and mechanics to get the ball in position in time, Jack is able to take the shot before anybody on Faze can defend it. And on the shot, he actually hits the ball into Chronic before it goes into goal. So he's the one that actually gets credit for it, and Jack gets the assist. But after all the work Chronic did to make this play happen, I'd say that he's earned that goal. But now as we go into the winter split, the ball is once again in Faze's court to try to turn this matchup in their favor. And as I mentioned before, they did that by beating Gen.G 3 times in a row during the winter split. And they managed to pull off these wins by once again relying on their great defense. But it was a little bit different than their great defense in their first winning streak. In that first streak, it was all about not letting Gen.G score goals at all. Because as I mentioned before, Gen.G had a really hard time scoring against Faze in their first 3 matchups. Now we did see glimpses of that same thing here in Faze's second winning streak, especially in their matchup in the Winter Invitational. Because in games 3, 4, and 5 of that series, Faze got the win by a score of 1-0. So there were some times when Faze just wouldn't let them score. But when they faced off in the Winter Cup and in the Winter Major, Gen.G was able to average over 2 goals per game in those series. So Faze's wins here weren't always about completely shutting down Gen.G's offense. But instead, we saw Faze start to use their great defense to create openings for their own offense. And the only way you're able to do something like that is through the counterattack. During these matches in the winter split, Faze got really comfortable with allowing Gen.G to set up in their offensive side of the field, while doing what it takes to hold them off long enough until they saw the right chance to turn the tables and pounce on any opening that Gen.G left in their defense while they were trying to score their own goal. And this ended up being especially true when these teams faced off in the winter major. In that series, the Faze clan players individually spent an average of 3 minutes and 17 seconds in the defensive third, while the Gen.G players individually averaged 2 minutes and 42 seconds in the defensive third. And if you'd rather hear it by percentages, then every Faze clan player spent more than 50% of their time in the defensive third, and no player on Gen.G even spent more than 45% of their time in the defensive third. And Abjack was especially an outlier because he spent 39% of his time in the defensive third, which is really, really low. Now I know that I kinda just threw a lot of numbers at you right there, but to summarize, Faze spent a lot of time on defense, but because of their great counterattacking, it ended up working out really well. Even in Game 5 of that series, which Faze won by a score of 6-1, making it the most one-sided game of the series, the ball was still on Faze's side of the field for 57.22% of the game, which is honestly mind-blowing for a team that outscored their opponent by 5 goals. Like, look at this heat map of where the ball was, and look how much thicker the colors are on the right side of the field than they are on the left. Scoring 6 goals and only allowing 1 when the heat map looks like that? That's basically counterattacking the city right there. But to look at gameplay examples of this, let's take a look at Game 1 of their matchup in the winter major. After the previous kickoff, Gen.G had the ball in Faze's half for almost 30 seconds non-stop, and they are putting on a lot of pressure trying to break Faze down, but Faze never folded. Then after Nolly sends the ball infield, but Jack isn't quite able to reach it, Jack turns around to retreat, and First Killer gets a strong clear to send the ball to the other side. And this puts Jack in a really tough spot, because nobody else from Gen.G is around to help him, and he had to use all of his boost to get back in time, so when it's finally time for him to get a hit on the ball, he doesn't have much left. And because of that, the touch that he does get is really weak and goes into the backboard, where First Killer is able to beat Chronic to the follow-up, and he scores the goal for Faze Clan. Now if you wanted to, you could chalk this up as being another defensive mistake, like Gen.G were making against Faze earlier in the season. And while yes, this isn't a great play from Jack on defense, the reason why it happened is because Faze Clan flipped the field so quickly and put Jack in a tough scenario of needing to make a really good play without many resources to make it, which is a product of Faze flipping the field so quickly and turning defense into offense in the blink of an eye. But for another example, later in that same game, Gen.G are again putting the pressure on Faze and getting threatening shots, but after Faze holds them off for long enough, their opportunity to bite back finally comes along. Jack's touch sends the ball across the field where First Killer is the first one to it, and Sypical sees that First Killer is going to get a free touch, so he starts leaking out to the other side of the field so he can receive the clear that First Killer gets. And sure enough, First Killer sends the ball upfield, and Sypical is able to grab the side boost and collect the ball with plenty of room around him. Then he gets this really nice flick on the ball to send it over Nolly and Chronic, which then leaves the goal wide open. First Killer tries to take the shot, but he's not able to reach the angle in time, and he can only hit it off the post. But with the net wide open and enough time to come in and take the shot, Mist once again comes up from his third man spot and scores the goal that gives Faze the lead over Gen.G in this Game 1. The ability to quickly turn defense into offense is one of the most important things a team can have in Rocket League, and Faze Clan showed in the winter split that not many teams are able to do that better than them. Alright, so by now, hopefully you have a clear picture of what the past has looked like for these two teams, both separately and when they took the field together as opponents. But now it's time to speculate a little bit, because there's very good reason to think that the future of this matchup won't look like the past. Gen.G and Faze have been the top two teams, but there are plenty of teams who are ready to break into that top two themselves. Complexity's only been getting better as the season goes on, and if they get any better than what they are right now, I don't know if either Faze or Gen.G will be able to hold them out of the top two. Then you have version 1 who just brought in Daniel, so you have to figure that they're going to make a big push in North America too. Then you have G2, who hasn't been quite as good as the other teams so far this season, but it would honestly be pretty foolish to count them out completely. And then of course, you have NRG waiting in the wings for their great comeback. Hold up a second. Sorry, I needed that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the fight for the top of North America is going to get a lot harder in the spring split. So when Faze and Gen.G face off again, which I'm sure they will, this match could very well be for the right to remain near the top instead of being at the top. And in my opinion, that makes winning this match even more important for both of these teams. So I'm really excited to see how this region is going to play out over the rest of the season. But until then, as always, thanks for watching. Wait, don't go yet. Real quick, let me give a shout out to my boy Prof for helping me craft and organize this video. He's a real one. Follow him on Twitter. Alright, now for real this time. Thanks for watching.
Every time I know it's always on the table.